At my daughter's wedding, my son-in-law smashed my face into the hot mashed potatoes. With a sneer, he told me to taste the food, calling me an old man. From that instant, my life veered onto a path I never could have foreseen. A path that continues to unfold in ways that stretch far beyond that single, unforgettable moment. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I speak as a father who carried every burden alone after the passing of my wife, who dreamed of seeing his daughter walk down the aisle radiant in her dress, believing that day would be filled with love and honor. Yet instead, I found myself pressed into the table with heat against my skin and laughter echoing in my ears. The hall was filled with light, the music played, the guests raised their glasses, but in that instant, everything fell silent inside me, except for the sting of betrayal and the sharp memory of my daughter's eyes turned away. I can still feel the texture of the food against my face, the heat searing, but more than that, I can still hear the sound of voices stifling shock and others releasing cruel laughter, a blend of disbelief and amusement that cut into me more than the act itself. In those moments, I remembered the years I had spent laboring at 2 jobs, saving every coin, ensuring she had not only food and clothing but opportunities to grow, to thrive, to step into a future brighter than my own. I thought of the nights I worked late shifts, hands blistered, back aching, returning home to find her asleep on the couch with her homework still spread across the table, and I would quietly cover her with a blanket, whispering that one day all my sacrifices would be worth it. And here I was, sitting in front of a room full of relatives and strangers, my dignity shoved into a dish, while the man she had chosen to bind her life to smirked with satisfaction. Yet even then, I did not shout, I did not strike, I did not rise in anger, for there are moments when silence holds more power than fury, and I knew in that moment that this story was only beginning. Around me, the hall returned to its rhythm. Music resumed, glasses clinked once more, but for me, time had shifted, every second now marked by the echo of that act and the vow forming quietly in my heart. I knew then that my silence would not be defeat, but the seed of something greater, that though they thought me humiliated, they had in truth awakened something in me that had long been tempered by hardship and endurance. As I wiped my face with the napkin handed reluctantly by a guest, I thought not of shame but of clarity, for the world had just shown me the faces of those who valued appearances over respect, and it was in that recognition that I began to plan. The potatoes washed away easily enough, but the memory clung, shaping every thought that followed, and it is that memory I now share with you, not as an end, but as the opening of a story that carries weight far beyond a wedding feast. My voice may be aged, my body slower, but my resolve is unbroken. And in the telling of this story, you will see how even the smallest moment of cruelty can be turned into a stage for truth. That day at the wedding was not the end of my dignity, but the beginning of its reclamation. A reclamation that would not come through anger or violence, but through patience, strategy, and the unshakable certainty that the truth always rises when the time is right. The moment after my son-in-law forced my face into the steaming mashed potatoes was one that stretched longer than any clock could measure, for as I pulled myself upright with food clinging to my cheeks and heat still burning my skin, the entire hall fell into a silence so sharp it cut through the music that had only seconds before been filling the air, and all eyes turned toward me, as though I had become part of the performance. I saw mouths frozen mid-laugh, forks paused in mid-air, and the shimmer of chandeliers reflecting in eyes that could not decide whether to widen in shock or narrow in amusement. And in that silence, I felt the weight of every gaze pressing on me more heavily than the food that had just been smeared across my face. Then the quiet broke, not with gasps of sympathy, but with laughter from the tables of the groom's side, the sound rising like cruel music, harsh and jeering, rolling across the hall in waves that seemed to grow louder with each second. I remained seated. I wiped my face with a napkin, trying to regain composure, but the more I tried to steady myself, the more the laughter grew, until it felt as though the very walls were echoing with mockery. I turned my eyes toward my daughter, hoping for a glance of concern, a word of defense, a gesture of kindness, but instead I saw her gaze fixed firmly on her plate, her face stiff, as though she had chosen silence rather than stand against her new husband's cruelty. That indifference struck me harder than the act itself, for I had always imagined that no matter the circumstance, she would rise to shield me as I had shielded her all her life, yet she chose to remain still while I bore the humiliation alone. Around me, the whispers began, soft at first, then louder as more people gave themselves permission to comment openly, their words laced with derision, calling me foolish for paying for a wedding that had turned into my own stage of embarrassment. I heard fragments like he deserved it, or that old man should have known better, drifting through the air like sharp stones hurled from hidden corners. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from the effort of holding myself steady, of refusing to let them see me falter further. I raised my glass, though it shook, and I sipped quietly as though nothing had happened. But I could feel the smirks all around me, the mocking glances exchanged between strangers and relatives alike, and I knew the story of that moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the hall. Even those from my own family who should have risen to my defense remained still, their silence a wound far deeper than any laughter could inflict, and I realized then how fragile loyalty could become when faced with public spectacle. The music eventually resumed, the toasts continued, and the evening carried on, yet beneath the surface of celebration there remained an undercurrent of ridicule that followed me with every step, every word, every gesture. I walked through the rest of that night with mashed potatoes no longer on my face, but clinging to my soul as a reminder of what had been taken from me. Yet even as humiliation burned in me, a quiet flame began to stir. For I knew that dignity once lost can be reclaimed, and that humiliation, when carried with patience, can be transformed into the very foundation of strength. That night, I left the hall not broken but silent, carrying within me the memory of every smirk, every whisper, every indifferent glance, and I promised myself that this story was not over, that the echoes of their laughter would one day be replaced by the silence of their shame. When I look back on the years that led me to that wedding hall, what comes to mind first are not the moments of humiliation, but the endless days and nights of sacrifice that carried my daughter from childhood into the life she now calls her own. For after her mother passed, it was left to me alone to play both father and mother, protector and provider, comfort and discipline, and I bore that role with a heart heavy but determined. I worked long hours in the factory, my hands roughened and scarred from machines that never paused, then left one shift only to walk into another job that kept me on my feet until the sky darkened, all so that she would never go without what other children seemed to take for granted. In the mornings, I would wake her with a smile, pack her small lunch, and watch her walk to school with her backpack bouncing, hiding from her the exhaustion that pressed into my bones, because I knew that what mattered most was that she saw stability where life had threatened to leave only loss. When she outgrew her shoes, I patched them twice before finally setting aside enough to buy new ones, And when her friends laughed at her clothes, I saved week after week until she could wear something that made her eyes sparkle with confidence. I skipped meals so she could eat, turned down small comforts so she could have books, and when tuition bills arrived, I worked nights so that her education would not suffer. I remember the pride on her face when she first slid behind the wheel of the used car I had scraped together enough to buy. The joy in her eyes worth more to me than any comfort I denied myself. And when the day came that she wanted the wedding of her dreams, I did not hesitate to open my savings, to cash out bonds, to stretch every account, because I believed that giving her that joy was the natural reward for every hardship endured. She never knew how many nights I sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before me, calculating which ones could wait, which ones could not, and silently deciding that my needs would always come last. She never saw how many times I worked through illness, forcing my body to continue because every paycheck meant another door kept open for her future. Even when loneliness threatened to weigh me down, I carried on, because her smile was the light that kept me moving. These sacrifices were not burdens, but choices made willingly, because the love of a father has no ledger, no balance sheet, no calculation other than the question of what more can I give? And so, when I sat in that hall and felt my dignity pressed into a plate of food, the sting was not only in the act itself, but in the memories of every mile walked, every hour labored, every dream deferred so she could have hers. Yet even then I did not let bitterness take root, for sacrifice has taught me patience, and patience has taught me that life is not measured in single moments, but in the long arc of what we build and what we protect. I remind myself that those years were not wasted, for love is never wasted, and even if gratitude is absent now, the truth of my sacrifices remains unshaken. The years I spent building her path are the very years that built my resolve, and they are the reason that no humiliation, however public, can strip away the strength I have carried all my life. Long before the wedding day, I had already seen the early red flags waving quietly in the background, signs that my son-in-law was not the man he pretended to be, though my daughter brushed them aside with laughter and insisted I was being too cautious, too protective, too unwilling to let her live her own life. I remember the first time he visited our home, his handshake quick and limp, his eyes darting around the room as though he were appraising it rather than appreciating the warmth of welcome. And when I offered him tea, he smirked and said he only drank what was expensive, a small comment that seemed harmless at the time but stayed with me. On birthdays, he would arrive late without apology, carrying gifts that looked impressive on the outside but were thoughtless in their substance. And when I asked him about his work, he brushed me off with vague answers, preferring instead to boast about connections and opportunities that never seemed to materialize. There were dinners where he made jokes at my expense, little barbs about my age or my old-fashioned ways. And though my daughter would laugh along nervously, I could see in her eyes that part of her felt uneasy. Yet she defended him afterward by saying he was only teasing, that he did not mean any harm. Once, when I tried to offer advice about managing money, he interrupted me with a smirk and said times had changed, that my way of thinking was outdated, and I saw in that moment the glimmer of arrogance that would only grow brighter with time. At family gatherings, he rarely helped with even the simplest tasks, sitting back with his phone in hand while others carried plates and set tables, and if asked directly, he would sigh as though the request were beneath him. I watched the way he treated waiters at restaurants, snapping his fingers or speaking down to them as though their work was less valuable than his time, and each time I felt a pang of worry for my daughter, wondering how long she could live with a man who carried such disregard for others. Yet whenever I brought up my concerns, she smiled, and told me that he had a good heart, that he was ambitious, that his confidence was simply part of who he was. And though I wanted to believe her, my instincts told me otherwise. Still, I bit my tongue, reminding myself that love often blinds the young, that perhaps time would soften his rough edges, that maybe fatherly worry was clouding my judgment. But the signs only grew clearer, from the way he dismissed her opinions in small conversations, to the way he inflated his own accomplishments as though the world revolved around him. One evening, when I overheard him speaking to a friend on the phone, his words careless and cruel, mocking those who worked hard for little pay, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. For I knew then that respect for others was not a value he carried. My daughter insisted that marriage was about building each other up, that he was still learning, that I should give him a chance. And though I wanted to protect her, I also wanted to preserve the bond between us, so I held back my strongest words. But the early red flags never faded. They multiplied, weaving themselves into a pattern that could not be ignored, and by the time the wedding came, I carried those worries quietly in my heart, hoping I was wrong but fearing I was right. And as I sat in that hall with my face pressed into food and laughter rising around me, I realized those warnings had been true all along, that the man I had doubted had finally revealed himself for all to see. The breaking point was not only the moment when my face met the heat of the mashed potatoes, but the culmination of years of silent warnings, overlooked signs, and unspoken doubts that all converged into a single instant so sharp it cut through the years of sacrifice I had poured into raising my daughter. For in that one act, the mask fell away, and everything I had tried to dismiss or ignore about my son-in-law stood exposed in front of me and in front of everyone else. As the laughter echoed in the hall, my heart did not break from the humiliation alone, but from the realization that this was no longer about careless jokes or minor slights. It was a deliberate act, a declaration that he believed I was nothing more than a man to be mocked. The food clung to my face for only seconds, but the weight of that moment pressed deeper than any physical force, carrying with it the sting of betrayal not only from him, but from the silence of those around me who chose laughter or indifference instead of defense. I sat there, wiping my cheeks with the napkin, my hands trembling not from weakness, but from the flood of memories rushing through me. Memories of late nights at work, of empty stomachs so my daughter could eat, of every coin I set aside so she would never feel the lack I had known, and in that flood I felt something harden. It was not anger that rose within me, but clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when the fog of denial lifts and you finally see what has been before you all along. I realized then that no more excuses could be made, no more hope that he would change, no more telling myself that perhaps he was simply rough around the edges. This was who he was, a man who believed respect was something he owed no one, not even the father of the woman who had chosen him. I sat quietly, letting the music and chatter resume, but inside me a vow began to take shape, a vow that I would not let that moment define me as the defeated old man he thought I was, but as the man who would reclaim his dignity in a way no one expected. The breaking point was not a collapse, it was a turning, the shift from patience to resolve, from endurance to strategy. As I looked at my daughter's face, her eyes avoiding mine, I felt the sting of her silence most of all, yet even that did not break me. It only deepened the determination now forming in my chest. I knew then that this story would not end with mashed potatoes on my skin, that the laughter of his relatives would one day be replaced by silence when the truth came to light. The breaking point gave me strength, for it stripped away the illusion that family ties alone could protect me, and in its place It left only the certainty that I had to protect myself and the legacy I had built. That night I walked out of the hall with food stains on my clothes but steel in my spine. For though he believed he had reduced me to nothing, he had in truth given me everything I needed, the moment of clarity that would guide every step I took thereafter. The breaking point was not the end, it was the beginning, and though no one else could see it yet, the path forward had already been set in motion within me. What cut deepest that night was not the laughter of strangers or the smirk of the man who had just humiliated me, but the silence of my own daughter, the child I had raised with every ounce of strength left in me after her mother passed. The little girl whose hand I once held as she took her first steps and whose tears I once wiped away when the world seemed too heavy for her small shoulders. When my face was shoved into that dish and the hall erupted in noise, my instinct was to look toward her, to search her expression for outrage, for concern, for any sign that the bond we had built together still carried weight in her heart. Yet what I found was her gaze lowered, her lips pressed tightly, her hands clasped in her lap, as though she had decided that silence was safer than standing by me. That silence spoke louder than any words she could have offered, louder than laughter, louder than jeers, louder even than the cruel command he had spat at me, for it told me that she had chosen to align herself with his pride rather than with my dignity. I tried to tell myself she was overwhelmed, that perhaps she was afraid to cause a scene on her wedding day, that maybe her silence was not agreement but hesitation, yet the longer I watched her avoid my eyes, the more I understood that silence can be a choice as sharp as a knife. All the memories of the years I had carried her alone rose in me. The nights of hunger I endured so she could eat, the extra shifts I worked so she could attend the schools her friends did, the car I bought with savings I could barely afford, the very wedding that had now turned into a stage for my disgrace. And in each of those memories I had pictured gratitude, not indifference. Yet, as the music resumed and she smiled faintly at her guests, it became clear that her silence was not a momentary lapse, but a decision to let the humiliation stand unchallenged, to let me carry the weight alone. The father in me ached to believe otherwise, but the man in me knew what I had witnessed, and it was the absence of her voice that echoed the loudest in my heart. I wondered in that moment if she remembered the nights I sat by her bed when she had fevers, if she remembered the long walks to school when I held her hand against the cold, if she remembered the sacrifices I made in silence so she could stand proudly in that dress. Yet she gave me no sign, no glance, no gesture that would tell me she saw me at all. The silence stretched through the evening like a shadow, following me with every step, and though others mocked me openly, it was her stillness that haunted me most. For strangers can wound your pride, but only your own child can wound your soul. I sat quietly, letting the night unfold, and though pain pressed into me, I kept my composure, for I understood then that speaking would not change her choice, and silence would serve me better than pleading for recognition she was unwilling to give. That silence became part of me, a reminder of where my strength must now come from, not from the bond I once believed unbreakable, but from the resolve that had carried me through every hardship before. It was in her silence that I found my own, not as weakness, but as preparation. For I knew that one day the quiet she had offered me in betrayal would be answered by the quiet I would wield with purpose. The aftermath of that night carried a weight heavier than the food that had been forced against my skin, for as the reception continued and I moved among the guests with as much dignity as I could gather, I began to hear the whispers ripple through the crowd, words not meant for me yet loud enough to pierce straight into my heart, voices mocking my role, questioning why I had spent so much on a wedding, only to be treated like the evening's entertainment. I walked past clusters of guests, who turned quickly when they saw me, their smirks betraying what their lips tried to hide. And in the corner of the room I overheard two men chuckling about how foolish I must have been to pour my life savings into a celebration that ended with me humiliated at my own table. A woman near the buffet whispered to another that it served me right for trying to hold on to authority at my age, and though I wanted to ignore her, the sting of her words clung to me. I caught sight of some of the groom's relatives slapping each other on the back, their laughter bold and unashamed, retelling the moment as if it were the highlight of the night, and every time they repeated it, the story grew bigger, turning into a performance they enjoyed more than the vows that had just been spoken. My steps grew heavier as I tried to navigate the hall, not because of the humiliation itself, but because of the realization that those around me seemed eager to erase the years of sacrifice and see me only as the butt of a cruel joke. Even as I approached my own family's table, I noticed eyes avoiding mine, as though they could not decide whether to comfort me or distance themselves from me to avoid sharing in the ridicule. My daughter remained silent still, her face smiling at guests as though nothing had happened. And in that smile, I felt the sharp reminder that I was standing alone. The shame I carried in those hours was not just from the act itself, but from the way it multiplied in whispers, laughter, and silence, growing larger with every retelling, until it felt as though the entire wedding was defined not by love or unity, but by the moment of my disgrace. Yet even as I walked through that storm of whispers, I kept my back straight and my eyes steady, for I knew that dignity cannot be taken by laughter unless one chooses to surrender it, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. Inside me a fire burned, not of anger but of resolve, and though the shame pressed down on me, I transformed it into fuel, reminding myself that humiliation can be endured but never forgotten, and that patience is the strongest ally of a man who has spent his life surviving hardships greater than public ridicule. When the night ended and the guests drifted away, I stood outside under the cool air, letting the wind wash away the echoes of their voices, and in that silence I made a promise to myself that what they had witnessed as shame would one day be remembered as the turning point of something far greater. The aftermath of that evening became not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where the whispers of others would no longer define me. For I had already begun to write the next part of my life, with a pen filled not with bitterness, but with unwavering resolve. When the reception was over, and the noise of laughter and whispers had faded into the night, I returned to my quiet home, and for the first time allowed myself to sit in stillness. And it was there that the internal monologue began, a flood of thoughts that would not let me rest, questions rising and falling like waves, demanding to know how love and sacrifice could have brought me to such a moment. I asked myself how the years of carrying her alone, of working past exhaustion, of saving every coin so she would never feel the sting of want, could have ended in a day where the man she chose mocked me so publicly. I thought of her silence, the way she lowered her eyes, and wondered if she had forgotten the father who sewed her school uniforms late at night when there was no money for new ones, or the father who stayed awake beside her bed when fevers kept her tossing until morning. My mind replayed every sacrifice, each one replayed against the backdrop of laughter echoing in the hall, and I struggled to reconcile the two, to understand how the foundation I had built with such care had become the stage for ridicule. Yet alongside the questions came another voice, quieter but stronger, reminding me that dignity is not destroyed by the actions of others, but by how one responds, that the true measure of a man is not whether he is struck down, but whether he rises with purpose. I told myself that though humiliation had been placed upon me, it did not define me, and that my silence at that table was not weakness but a choice, the first step in a path that would one day reveal more than anyone in that room could have imagined. The thoughts turned from sorrow to reflection, from reflection to resolve, and soon I found myself speaking aloud in the empty room, telling her photograph on the wall that I had endured, that I had not lashed out, and that I would not allow bitterness to poison the years that remained to me. My inner voice reminded me that patience had carried me through every trial before, through poverty, through loss, through loneliness, and it would carry me again now, guiding me toward a justice that would come not from anger but from truth. Still, I could not escape the ache of betrayal, the knowledge that my daughter had chosen silence, and I asked myself again and again whether I had done too much for her, whether I had failed her by giving without teaching her the weight of gratitude. Yet even that pain I began to turn into fuel. For if her silence had wounded me, it had also awakened in me the understanding that I could not rely on others for vindication, that the responsibility to reclaim my dignity rested on my own shoulders. In the quiet of that night, with the clock ticking softly and the house filled only with memories, I made peace with my thoughts, telling myself that the story was not over, that the laughter of one evening would not erase the years of devotion that came before, and that the silence of my daughter would not be the last word. The internal monologue that began in sorrow ended in resolve, a promise to myself that I would endure, I would plan, and I would act, and that when the time came the truth would rise, not through noise or anger, but through the steady hand of a father who had weathered storms far greater than one night of ridicule. In the days that followed the wedding, as the echoes of laughter and whispers faded but never truly left my mind, I found within myself a new kind of strength, for out of the humiliation and silence came clarity, and clarity gave birth to resolve, the kind that does not shout or strike, but waits patiently, quietly building a foundation beneath the surface. I told myself that I would not rise in anger, for anger fades too quickly, nor would I lower myself to the level of those who mocked me, for their cruelty was its own punishment, but instead I would reclaim my dignity through patience, through planning, through the kind of steady resolve that has carried me through every trial before. I knew I could not change the moment that had already passed, nor could I erase the sting of my daughter's silence, but I could shape what came after, and in that shaping I could remind them all that the strength of a father is not measured in a single night, but in the choices he makes across a lifetime. I thought of every sacrifice I had made, of every hour worked, of every coin saved, and I realized that my greatest weapon was not force but the truth of how much they still relied upon me, for the very life they flaunted, the house they called their own, the celebrations they enjoyed, were all rooted in the foundations I had laid. My resolve was to let them believe I had been broken, to let them think I had been silenced, while inside me I prepared to show them that silence can be louder than any outcry when the time is right. I spent long nights sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, telling myself that patience would be my ally, that time would reveal what arrogance cannot see, and that dignity lost in one instant can be restored in another far more powerful moment. I did not share these thoughts with anyone, not even with the few friends who noticed the change in my face, for I understood that resolve grows strongest in quiet soil, nurtured away from prying eyes. In my heart I spoke often to her, my wife who had gone before, telling her that I would not falter, that though her daughter had chosen silence, I would carry on with the same devotion I had shown when we first built our lives together, and that I would honor her memory by ensuring our legacy was not twisted into mockery. My resolve was not born of vengeance, but of love. Love for the years of labor, love for the sacrifices, love for the dignity that deserved to remain unbroken. And though the world had seen me covered in food, I knew one day they would see me covered in quiet strength instead. A father's resolve is not easily shaken, for it is forged in long nights of worry, in endless days of work, in the steady carrying of burdens too heavy for others to bear. And as I looked ahead, I knew that the burden of silence would soon transform into the weight of truth, and truth, once revealed, would carry more force than any act of cruelty ever could. And so I rose each morning with a calm spirit, living my days as if nothing had changed. But within me the resolve grew sharper, clearer, stronger, preparing me for the moment when patience would meet opportunity, and the dignity they thought they had taken from me would rise in full measure once again. What many in that hall did not know, and what my son-in-law surely never considered as he pressed my face into the food, was that the very celebration he strutted through, and the new life he boasted about, were tied firmly to strings that ran back to me, strings he could not see but which I held with steady hands. For the truth was that much of the money behind the wedding, behind their new home, behind the comfort they wore like a badge of honor, came not from him, but from the accounts and assets I had built and still controlled. When my daughter first spoke of her dream wedding, I did not hesitate to step forward, not because I was eager for praise, but because I wanted her day to be radiant, a moment that reflected the years of sacrifice behind it. And so I opened the savings I had guarded, knowing every coin represented long hours of labor, and I poured them into her joy. When they found the house they wanted, she came to me quietly, saying the bank had hesitated, and without question I placed my name where theirs could not stand alone, tying the foundation of their future to the credit and stability I had earned through decades of toil. Even the car he drove so proudly, the vacations they boasted of, and the little luxuries that filled their days were shadows cast by the work of my hands, work he never once acknowledged, but depended upon all the same. He thought his arrogance made him powerful, but the truth was, his pride was built on scaffolding I had erected, scaffolding that could crumble with a single decision if I chose to withdraw what was mine. I had not spoken of these things to anyone, not even to my closest friends, for I understood that real strength is quiet, and the greatest power comes from letting others underestimate you. As I sat in the silence of my home after that wedding, I reminded myself that he may have thought he had taken my dignity, but in reality, he was standing on ground that I could pull out from under him without raising my voice. Every contract, every signature, every note of ownership still carried my name, and in that truth I found not only comfort but direction, for it reminded me that the story was not one of defeat but of preparation. I looked at the documents I kept neatly stored, deeds, account statements, insurance policies, all evidence that though they believed themselves independent, the strings of their fortune were tied securely in my grasp. This knowledge gave me patience, for I understood that the day would come when those strings would be pulled, not out of anger, but out of necessity, to remind them where their stability truly came from. A man may mock another to entertain a crowd, but when the lights dim and the laughter fades, he must still face the reality of where his security lies. And my son-in-law had yet to learn that lesson. The financial strings I held were not weapons to be wielded carelessly, but they were anchors of truth, and in time they would reveal what boasting could never hide. I carried that knowledge with me quietly, going about my days as though nothing had changed, but inside I knew that patience was on my side. For while arrogance rises quickly, it also falls quickly, and when it does, the strings of reality remain. Once I understood the strength I still held in those financial strings, I began the quiet work of strategic planning, not out of spite but out of a calm determination to restore balance and dignity, for I knew that rushing forward in anger would only serve his arrogance, while patience would allow me to move unseen until the right moment arrived. My first step was to meet discreetly with the lawyer who had long advised me, a man who knew not only the details of my estate but also the weight of my intentions, and together we reviewed every account, every deed, every signature tied to my name. I spoke little, letting him explain the options, but in my silence I felt the power of knowledge settling firmly in my hands, the certainty that no matter how loudly my son-in-law boasted, he remained tethered to the foundations I had laid. From there I sought the guidance of a financial advisor who had once helped me through lean years, a woman whose honesty I trusted, and I listened carefully as she explained how to secure assets in a way that would shield them from misuse while keeping control firmly under my authority. I asked questions not of revenge but of protection, how to safeguard the future I had built with sweat and sacrifice so that it would not be squandered by arrogance or recklessness, and in her answers I found the clarity I had been seeking. Slowly, methodically, I began making adjustments, moving funds, restructuring agreements, updating beneficiaries, each decision a quiet stone placed into the foundation of the plan I was building. I kept folders neatly organized, papers signed and dated, and I locked them away where no greedy hand could reach. Each evening I returned home with a steady calm, sipping my tea by the fire, reminding myself that true strength is not in raising one's voice, but in knowing when to act. To the outside world I remained the quiet old man, humiliated and overlooked, but inside I was sharpening my resolve, step by step, shaping a strategy that would not only reclaim my dignity, but reveal the truth of who had depended on me all along. I allowed him to believe he had won, allowed him to smirk in gatherings, to strut in front of others as though his place was secure. For the deeper he sank into arrogance, the greater the impact would be when the ground shifted beneath him. I planned not only for myself, but for the memory of my wife. For the years we had both labored to create a foundation for our daughter, and I vowed that those years would not be erased by a man who mistook cruelty for strength. Each signed document, each secured asset, each step in the plan was a tribute to that promise. And though no one around me could see the gears turning, I knew that I was preparing a moment that would echo louder than any laughter ever thrown my way. Strategic planning became my companion, and in its quiet rhythm I found peace. For I knew the time would come when patience would give way to revelation, and when that day arrived, I would be ready. Once my strategic planning was set in motion, I knew the next step was digging deeper. For while I already understood that my son-in-law's pride was propped up by my sacrifices, I needed to uncover the truth of his own foundations, the debts and schemes he had tried to bury beneath his charm and arrogance. I began quietly, requesting reports through channels I had long trusted, pulling credit histories and financial records that painted a picture far different from the one he flaunted so boldly. What I found confirmed every instinct I had carried, for behind the designer suits and flashy car lay unpaid loans, overdue bills, and a history of reckless spending that stretched back years. His talk of business ventures, which he had often boasted about at family gatherings, were in truth hollow shells, Companies opened and closed in quick succession, each one leaving behind a trail of debt that he had managed to keep from my daughter's eyes. I discovered that even the ring he had placed on her finger was not purchased with his earnings, but financed on credit, another link in a chain he had wrapped tightly around himself. With each page I studied, I felt not anger, but clarity. The calm satisfaction of a man who finally sees the full map of the battlefield before him. I shared these findings only with my lawyer and advisor, ensuring that every piece of evidence was recorded and secured. For I understood that when the time came to reveal the truth, it would need to be undeniable to him, to my daughter, and to every witness who had once laughed at my expense. I also began watching his behavior more closely, noting the way he always reached for the most expensive option at restaurants, though he rarely offered to pay. The way he spoke of future plans filled with grandeur, but provided no details of how they would be achieved. The way he leaned heavily on my daughter's trust, knowing she would never question him as long as he smiled and spoke confidently. I asked discreet questions of people in his circle, men who had once worked with him, neighbors who had seen his patterns, and their answers were filled with stories of overdrawn accounts, of deals gone sour, of a man who lived as though tomorrow would always provide without him ever lifting the weight today. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. For I knew now that his world was built on illusions, and illusions collapse when light is finally cast upon them. My digging did not stop at finances alone, for I sought also to understand the patterns of his character, the way he treated those around him when he thought no one was watching, and what I found was consistent with the arrogance I had long suspected. He dismissed people of lower station, he belittled those who questioned him, and he sought to control situations not through wisdom, but through intimidation. Each revelation became another piece of the puzzle I was assembling, a puzzle that, when completed, would reveal the full truth of who he truly was. I kept my discoveries hidden, storing them in neat folders alongside the documents I had already prepared, and each night, as I placed them away, I felt the strength of patience grow within me. He believed me to be the old man broken by public shame, yet in reality I was the quiet hand collecting every stone he had left unguarded, stones that would one day build the wall he could not climb. Digging deeper did not exhaust me, it steadied me. For with every fact uncovered, I knew the day would come when the mask he wore would fall, and when it did, it would not be by my anger but by his own truth, brought fully into the light. While the evidence piled quietly in my study, I learned to wear the calm facade of the weary old man they believed me to be, and I wore it with precision, for it was in their underestimation that my greatest strength lay. At family gatherings, I allowed them to see me moving slowly, sipping my tea quietly, smiling faintly as though I had accepted the humiliation at the wedding as something I could never overcome. And in their eyes, I watched the arrogance grow bolder, mistaking my silence for surrender. My son-in-law strutted more confidently than ever, laughing at his own stories, making sly remarks about age and irrelevance, each one another attempt to reinforce the illusion that he had triumphed over me. I let him believe it, nodding occasionally, pretending not to notice the smirks exchanged across the table, and in doing so I drew him deeper into the comfort of his own pride. My daughter, still silent, seemed relieved that I did not challenge him, mistaking my composure for acceptance, and so she leaned into his side as if the matter had been settled forever. But within me the truth grew sharper each day. For while they saw only a man who had retreated into quiet, I knew I was a man preparing patiently for the day when silence would give way to revelation. I made small talk about the weather, about the harvest, about the simple things that fill empty spaces, while my mind measured every word, every gesture, calculating how each would serve the greater plan. I laughed gently at his boasts, even joining in when he poked fun at me, for I understood that the more convinced he was of my defeat, the less careful he would become, and in his carelessness he would reveal more of himself than he ever intended. Each evening, after playing my part at these gatherings, I returned home to the folders locked away, reviewing them by the light of the lamp, reminding myself that truth was my ally and time my companion. The calm facade was not an act of cowardice, but of control, for I knew I could not allow them to see the fire that still burned in me. Not yet, not until the moment was right. My wife's photograph on the mantel seemed to watch me with approval, her eyes as steady as they had been in life, as if to remind me that endurance was always our greatest weapon, and I spoke to her often in those quiet hours, promising that our sacrifices would not be wasted, that I would not falter now when everything depended on patience. Playing the calm facade became second nature, a mask I wore so seamlessly that even the sharpest eyes in the room could not see the resolve hidden beneath it, and though the world thought me diminished, I knew I was preparing for the greatest revelation of my life. It takes strength to fight, but it takes even greater strength to appear as though you have surrendered, when in truth you are holding all the pieces, waiting for the moment when the game can be revealed in its entirety. And so I smiled, I nodded, I sat quietly, and I let them bask in their illusion, all the while knowing that every boast, every laugh at my expense, every smirk exchanged across the table, was leading them closer to the moment when silence would end and truth would rise. The gathering of evidence became my quiet mission, carried out with the patience of a man who has lived long enough to understand that truth must be prepared carefully before it can be revealed. And each day I added another piece to the collection that would one day dismantle the illusions my son-in-law so proudly displayed. I began with the financial records, requesting certified copies of every document that bore his name, tracing the lines of credit, the unpaid loans, and the hollow companies he had boasted about so often. And I placed them in folders labeled with dates and notes in my own hand, so that no detail could be overlooked. I asked the bank for transaction histories, and found transfers that led nowhere, payments that were missed, accounts that told the story of a man drowning beneath the surface while pretending to float. From there I sought property records, deeds and titles that revealed not ownership but debts hidden beneath layers of bluster, and I kept them neatly stacked, knowing that the paper itself would one day speak louder than any words I could say. I reached out to contacts who had worked with him in the past, men and women who carried their own scars from his schemes, and I wrote down their statements, each one another thread in the tapestry I was weaving. A tapestry that, when unfurled, would leave no room for denial. Even the smallest details, receipts from extravagant purchases made on borrowed credit, letters from collection agencies, notes from failed ventures, all found their way into my growing archive. And with each edition I felt the strength of preparation settle more firmly in my bones. I spoke with my lawyer often, reviewing the files together, making sure every document was authentic, every claim backed by undeniable proof, and with his guidance I ensured that the evidence was not only convincing but unassailable. At night I spread the papers across my table, the lamplight shining on the columns of numbers, the signatures, the stamps, and I studied them until I could recite the story of his failures by heart. The more I gathered, the calmer I became, for I understood that arrogance thrives in shadows, but withers when brought into the open, and I was preparing the light that would expose it fully. My son-in-law continued his performances at family gatherings, mocking me with sly remarks, laughing with his companions. Yet all the while he remained unaware that every boast he made only deepened the contrast that would soon be revealed. My daughter smiled beside him, oblivious to the foundation crumbling beneath his feet, and though her silence still pained me, I told myself that when the truth came forth, she too would see what I had always known. The gathering of evidence gave me purpose, turning humiliation into determination, and though no one else could see it, I carried with me the quiet certainty of a man holding the future in his hands. Each folder, each page, each note was a stone in the wall I was building, a wall that would stand firm against the storm of denial I knew was coming, and when the moment arrived to show it, there would be no cracks, no weaknesses, nothing for arrogance to cling to. The world saw me as an old man moving quietly through his days, but in truth I was the careful architect of revelation, and with every piece of evidence I gathered, I drew closer to the day when silence would no longer be my only weapon, but truth itself would stand before them, undeniable and complete. The perfect stage is never chosen in haste. It is built with intention, with foresight, with the quiet patience of a man who understands that timing is the sharpest blade, and so I waited until the right moment revealed itself, until the air was thick with certainty that nothing could disrupt their pride. I knew that to reclaim my dignity fully, I would need more than evidence. I would need witnesses. People from both families gathered in one place where truth could not be dismissed as rumor or twisted into falsehood. And so I studied the calendar of events, the anniversaries, the celebrations, and I chose carefully. My son-in-law and my daughter, still glowing in the arrogance of their new life, planned a family dinner to mark the passing of a year since their engagement, inviting relatives from near and far, the kind of gathering that drew both sides of the family into one hall, eager to feast, laugh, and share stories. To them it was simply another chance to flaunt their place, to show the world how secure and strong they believed themselves to be. But to me it was the perfect stage, the moment when all eyes would be present and no denial could escape the weight of evidence I carried. I prepared in silence, organizing the folders until they formed a narrative so clear that even the most doubtful witness would see the truth, rehearsing in my mind how I would speak, not with anger, not with spite, but with the calm authority of a man who has nothing left to prove. I did not speak of it to anyone, for secrecy was my greatest ally, and the fewer who knew, the greater the shock would be when the curtain finally lifted. In the days leading up to the gathering, I continued my role as the quiet old man, smiling faintly, sipping tea, nodding at the boastful remarks of my son-in-law, letting him believe he still held the stage, even as I built one larger than he could imagine. I could see his arrogance growing, his jests sharper, his confidence louder, and each act of pride only confirmed that the stage was ready, that he had prepared the audience himself with his own behavior, setting the scene for the fall that was to come. The night before the gathering, I laid out the papers across my table once more, the lamplight shining on signatures, debts, and truths he had hidden so carefully, and I felt the presence of my wife in the room, her steady gaze reminding me that patience had always been our strength. I whispered to her photograph that tomorrow would be the day, that the years of sacrifice, the moments of humiliation, the silence that had weighed so heavily on me, would all be given meaning, and I felt a calm settle over me, like the steadying of the sea after a storm. The perfect stage was not about revenge, but about truth, not about noise, but about silence broken at last. And as I closed the folders and placed them neatly in my case, I knew the time had come. I slept that night, not restlessly, but with a strange peace. For in my heart I understood that the path I had walked had led me here, to this moment, where dignity would rise again not in private but in full view, and the same voices that once laughed would soon fall into silence. The confrontation came with the weight of inevitability, for as the family gathered in the hall filled with food, music, and the careless laughter of those convinced the night would belong to them, I sat quietly at the edge of the table, my case at my side, waiting for the moment when pride would rise high enough to be toppled. My son-in-law, brimming with the same arrogance that had carried him through every gathering since the wedding, wasted no time in making his presence felt, his voice loud, his stories exaggerated, his remarks sharp as he sought to entertain his side of the family at my expense once again. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as he recalled the mashed potato incident with a mocking laugh, gesturing toward me as if I were still the spectacle, and the room responded with uneasy chuckles, some out of loyalty to him, others out of discomfort, but all eyes turned toward me, expecting the same silence I had offered before. It was then, in that pause, where his arrogance hung in the air like smoke, that I placed my hands on the case and slowly drew it onto the table, the sound of its latch clicking open, silencing the laughter as effectively as any shout could have. I looked at him calmly, not with anger, but with a steadiness that made the room lean in closer, and I spoke in a measured tone, telling him that there are moments in life when truth must be laid bare, and tonight was such a moment. He laughed again, louder this time, trying to mask the unease that flickered in his eyes, but his bravado could not cover the stillness that had fallen over the room. I pulled the first folder free, sliding it across the table with deliberate care, the pages within carrying his debts, his failed ventures, his unpaid loans, and as I began to read aloud the details, the whispers rose behind me, the guests craning their necks, their earlier amusement giving way to disbelief. He tried to interrupt, his voice sharp, but I lifted my hand and continued, my words calm, each one backed by ink and signature, each one a stone placed into the wall of truth that surrounded him. My daughter's face grew pale, her eyes fixed on the documents, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, yet finding no words, and the silence from her struck me as both painful and necessary, for she too needed to see what I had uncovered. The confrontation was not in raised voices or angry gestures, but in the undeniable weight of evidence laid bare before witnesses who could no longer pretend. I revealed more folders, each one another chapter of his deception, each page a reminder that the life he flaunted had been built on sand, and the more I spoke, the smaller his figure seemed, his smirk fading, his laughter caught in his throat. The relatives shifted uneasily, some glancing at one another, some shaking their heads, and the same hall that once rang with their laughter at my humiliation now sat in heavy silence, watching as arrogance unraveled in real time. When I had said all that needed to be said, I closed the folder gently, folded my hands, and looked at him not with vengeance but with quiet certainty, for the confrontation was not about defeating him with anger, but about reclaiming my dignity with truth. And in that moment, as the weight of the evidence hung over him, I knew the balance had shifted, that the man who once mocked me had been stripped of the stage he thought was his, and the room, filled with witnesses, would carry the memory of that moment far longer than they ever carried the laughter of the wedding night. The big reveal unfolded with a gravity that even I had not fully anticipated, for as I laid each document upon the table and spoke of the truth they carried, the hall that once echoed with laughter grew so still that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall, each second marking the unraveling of the illusion my son-in-law had built around himself. I began with the debts, reading the numbers aloud so that none could deny the weight of what was written, showing the signatures that tied him to loans unpaid, ventures abandoned, promises broken. I moved to the failed businesses, presenting the records of companies opened in name only, dissolved in silence, each one leaving behind another trail of unpaid bills and disappointed partners. Then came the credit history. Lines of purchases made with money he did not have, luxuries paraded in front of family and friends, cars and jewelry and vacations, all financed by the emptiness of borrowed credit. Each receipt a piece of evidence that stripped away his boastful pride. I spoke clearly, not with malice, but with the calm tone of a man who has nothing to prove. And with each word I felt the atmosphere shift, the smirks fading, the whispers rising, until all that remained was the undeniable truth spread across the table for every eye to see. My daughter sat frozen, her gaze locked on the papers, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for one of the folders, her silence louder than any words she might have spoken. My son-in-law tried to laugh it off, insisting the papers were taken out of context, that debts were temporary, that ventures always carried risk, but his voice cracked, and the confidence that once carried him faltered under the weight of eyes that no longer saw him as strong but as exposed. I revealed then the final detail, the truth that the home they lived in, the very roof over their heads, was secured not by his efforts, but by my name, my credit, my sacrifice, and I placed the deed on the table for all to see, the ink clear, the ownership undeniable. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the same mouths that once laughed at me now hanging open in disbelief. For the man they had admired, the man they had defended, was shown for what he truly was, dependent not on his own strength, but on the shoulders of the Father he had humiliated. The reveal was not just about numbers or documents. It was about stripping away the mask he had worn, showing him in the raw light of truth that left no room for pride or pretense. He sat there, his face drained of color, his words stumbling as he tried to gather the shards of his arrogance, but nothing he said could stand against the solidity of ink and paper. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply let the truth speak for itself, and in that silence I reclaimed the dignity he thought he had stolen from me. The big reveal was not a performance for my benefit. It was a moment of clarity for everyone in that room, a reminder that arrogance built on lies will always collapse when truth arrives. And as I closed the final folder and rested my hands upon it, I knew that the echoes of that moment would remain far longer than the taste of mashed potatoes or the sting of whispers, for the truth had spoken, and nothing could silence it now. The shock that followed the big reveal swept through the room like a sudden wind, toppling the fragile confidence that had filled the air only moments before, and I watched as faces shifted from disbelief to shame, from laughter to silence, until the weight of truth pressed down so heavily that even the strongest voices could find no words. My son-in-law, once so loud and certain, sat frozen in his chair, his eyes darting across the papers as though he might find an escape hidden in the lines of ink. Yet every page only deepened his collapse, exposing debts he could no longer deny and dependencies he could no longer disguise. He tried to rise, his voice breaking as he muttered excuses about investments and risks, about temporary setbacks and future plans. But the more he spoke, the more his words unraveled. Stumbling against the undeniable proof that lay before him, my daughter's face paled, her lips trembling as she looked from the documents to him, and though she did not speak, the silence between them grew heavy, carrying with it the weight of realization that the man she had chosen was not the provider he claimed to be, but a pretender whose pride had been propped up by the father he mocked. Guests shifted in their seats, their whispers growing louder, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and judgment, and I knew that the same mouths that once repeated the story of my humiliation would now carry the story of his collapse, retelling it in detail for years to come. The arrogance that once defined him drained away like water through cracked stone, leaving behind only the raw truth of his dependence, and the smirk that had so often curled his lips was replaced by the tightness of fear. His relatives, who had laughed at me on the wedding day, avoided his gaze now, their shoulders stiff, their earlier confidence abandoned, as they realized the foundation of their pride had crumbled in a single evening. Even those on my side of the family, who had once remained silent or uncertain, looked at me with new eyes, their expressions softening as they recognized the patience and strength it had taken to endure until this moment. The collapse was not loud, not dramatic in gesture, but quiet, drawn out, a man unraveling in front of those who once admired him, a mask slipping piece by piece until nothing was left but the truth. I sat calmly, my hands folded, my voice steady, watching not with glee but with solemn clarity. For the scene before me was not a triumph of revenge, but the natural consequence of arrogance exposed. The room that once rang with laughter at my expense now carried only the murmur of disbelief, and in that murmur I heard the sound of justice, not delivered by anger, but by patience, not through force, but through the steady hand of truth. My son-in-law collapsed not by my doing alone, but by his own choices, his own deceptions, and as he sat there trembling beneath the gaze of family and friends, I understood that the humiliation he had forced upon me had returned to him with greater weight, for mine had lasted a night, but his would echo for far longer. The shock that swept through the room that evening would not be forgotten, for it was written not only on paper but on the faces of every witness, and in their silence I knew the story had shifted forever. Vindication did not arrive with applause or cheering. It came in the quiet recognition that spread through the room, the subtle shift in the eyes of those who had once mocked me, and the calm strength I felt in my own chest as I sat at the table with the truth laid bare before them all. For so long I had carried the weight of silence, allowing their laughter and their arrogance to settle upon me like dust, waiting patiently for the right moment to rise. And when that moment came, it was not marked by fury but by clarity, a clarity that turned every whisper of ridicule into a silence of respect. As I looked around the hall, I saw guests who had once chuckled at my expense, now avoiding my gaze out of shame, others nodding subtly as though to admit they had misjudged me, and still others leaning forward in stunned respect for the evidence that spoke louder than any boast could. My son-in-law, stripped of his mask, could no longer meet my eyes, his hands clutching at the papers as though holding them might change their meaning. But the weight of his own actions pressed him down until his shoulders slumped and the collapse was complete. My daughter's silence remained, but in her silence there was no longer indifference. There was recognition, the dawning awareness that her father had endured humiliation with patience and had responded not with anger but with wisdom, revealing the truth in a way that no one could deny. In that moment I felt no need to raise my voice or claim victory, for vindication is not about proving others wrong. It is about standing firm in the truth you have carried all along and letting that truth speak for itself. I thought back to the night of the wedding, to the mashed potatoes pressed against my face, to the laughter ringing in my ears, and I realized that those who mocked me then would remember this moment far longer, not because I had sought to humiliate anyone, but because the dignity they thought had been stolen from me had risen higher than before. Vindication is a quiet fire, burning steady, and it warmed me from within as I sat among them, feeling the presence of my wife in my heart, knowing that she would have smiled at the strength I had shown, the patience I had kept, and the justice that had unfolded not through rage, but through resolve. I did not gloat. I did not smile with triumph. I simply gathered the papers, returned them to my case, and closed it with the same calm I had opened it, for the lesson had already been written in the minds of everyone present. The humiliation they had witnessed at the wedding was erased, not by denial, but by a greater story, one of endurance, sacrifice, and truth, and I knew then that my dignity had not only been restored, but strengthened. As I sat quietly in that hall, I felt the weight of years of sacrifice validated, the long nights of labor, the choices that put her needs before mine, all of it honored in the simple fact that truth had prevailed. Vindication was not loud. It did not need to be, for it echoed in the silence that followed, in the stillness of voices once quick to laugh, and in the respect that now lingered in the air like a calm after the storm. It did not arrive like a thunderclap, but like a gentle stillness, a calm that settled over me once the storm had passed. And when the last of the guests had gone and the evidence was safely tucked away, I walked home beneath the quiet night sky, with a step lighter than I had carried in years. The laughter that once haunted me no longer echoed with power. The humiliation no longer clung to my skin, for I understood at last that dignity is never stolen by others but discovered within. And in reclaiming mine, I honored not only my own name, but the years of sacrifice that had brought me to this moment. I thought of my wife, of the promises we once whispered in the dark, of the life we built from scraps and hope, and I knew she would have been proud to see patience outlast pride, silence guard me until truth had its moment to rise. My daughter's silence still lingered in my chest, yet I carried no bitterness, for love can be clouded by blindness, and I trusted that time would clear her sight, that she would come to understand what it meant for a father to endure without striking, to hold ground without shouting, and to protect the legacy of family with calm resolve. Each morning after, I rose with peace, tending the garden, sipping tea, letting the sun warm my face, reminded always that true strength lives not in the noise of victory, but in the quiet certainty of having remained faithful to who you are. Those who once mocked me no longer met my eyes, and in their avoidance lay not rejection but acknowledgement, the quiet concession that truth had spoken louder than their arrogance. What was broken in the eyes of others had been mended where it mattered most, in the chambers of my own heart. I often told myself that life is not measured by the humiliations endured, but by the way one rises after them. And in rising, I had proven that even an old man can stand taller than those who mistook age for weakness. The future remains uncertain, as all futures do. But I carry forward the lesson that patience is never wasted, that silence holds its season, and that truth, once brought into the light, can never again be buried. So, I close this chapter not with anger or sorrow, but with a calm reflection, knowing that betrayal may cut deep, yet it awakens a strength forged only through love, sacrifice, and endurance. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.